The cat and mouse game with EDR and XDR. This is part 3. So in the previous video, we talked about an agnostic view of endpoint detection response and extended detection response. And based on a lot of feedback, people wanted to see the mapping in regards to how this aligns to Cisco security capabilities. And so I've completed the endpoint detection response, and this is now the third and final video in the series. And this is going to focus on the XDR component. So extended detection response, going beyond endpoint detection and response, which is great, but is limited to the endpoint and agent that's installed. I want to know beyond what happened on the endpoint, because there might be other observations that are critically important that tells the whole story. And not only that, maybe the compromise is much larger than I first thought. So endpoint detection response, critically important. It's a must-have, but XDR empowers what we learn on the endpoint and the network and email and all the other components and pulls it all together so we can get a complete view of what took place. And so when we look at a platform like XDR, we expect things like malware, IPS, security intelligence events, all being centrally located, allowing us to use the observations found there to pivot and again find out more of the story. As an example, I have a SHA-256. I may want to be able to ask the rest of my infrastructure or technologies what they know about that sample. And so that might be, did you see it in email? Did you see it on an endpoint? Did you see it on the network somewhere? Right? All of this is tremendously valuable about understanding what truly took place. Same thing with flow-based alarms, right? From a network security analytics platform that looks at the flow data and can make decisions based on either behavioral or signature-based, whether or not something suspect is happening. And so what we want to do again is use those observations found from the alarm that was triggered to extend our view. Then you get things like files, email, DNS, sandboxing, web, IP address, endpoints, and forensics. Forensics beyond the endpoint, right? We want DNS forensics. We want flow analytics. We want all of that information to help pull the complete story together. We want actionable and the ability to do systemic response. So if I take action against a file, as an example, I don't want to have to log into a next-gen firewall. I don't want to have to log into an endpoint and email product to get this all these defensive capabilities in play. I want this to happen automatically. Then you got tactics and techniques. The more we understand what took place on the compromise itself, or what tactics the adversary had used, the better defensive capabilities we can put in place, making it very difficult for the adversary to overcome. This is the hardest defensive capability that we could implement, if we can implement it, for the adversary to overcome. Automation, orchestration. So if I do see an event, I want certain stuff to kick off automatically, right? Based on what might have took place. So example might be that if there was a phishing email, maybe I want to do a forensic snapshot automatically on the endpoint. I want to query the rest of our devices that exist in the environment to see what other things that they might know about it. I might even want to create a Teams room and put the SecOps people automatically in that Teams room and also dump the information that we learn about that file. For example, that was part of the phishing campaign. Automatically put all that information in the hands of the people that need it and not have to worry about them finding that information, provide that to them as it's happening. And so when we look at XDR, these are some of the things that we certainly expect to be in that platform-based approach. And what's cool with Cisco is everything here Cisco security products can do. Now, what we've done on top of that, or what Cisco's done, is that they've taken all of these cool capabilities, right? Like next-gen firewall, secure endpoint, umbrella, all of these capabilities, and they've made the modules in a platform called SecureX, and that's the XDR engine that's going to provide the XDR capabilities, including the automation and orchestration component and dashboarding. So centralizing your dashboards in a single interface is going to be helpful for sure. Now, what's really cool about it is that all of these products now kind of turn into what I like to call data ponds. A lot of people are trying to build data lakes, but they're very expensive to do. And so I look at this as more like data ponds. You can still build data lakes. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but if you're not there yet, maybe this is the first best step, is that you use the technologies that have the information in them and you query them in real time as needed. And that's what SecureX is going to do. It's going to turn all of these into really smart sensors with a lot of really cool intelligence. And it's going to go out and query using the threat response application within SecureX and say, look, have you seen this SHA-256? Provide me the insight, and I'll draw the relations graph so you can see what took place visually. So when we look at breaking this down a little bit and digging a little bit deeper, what is each of the components within Cisco security products that are added to SecureX's modules? What do they provide? And so if you look at Cisco Secure Endpoint, which was formerly called AMP for Endpoints, you can see that SecureX, essentially the endpoint turns into a sensor, and SecureX is used to detect the presence of files and network connections to specific hosts. It can be used to respond. I can do host isolation from either through an automated process, through the Cisco Threat Response tool, just like I would if I was in the interface on Endpoint AMP. And then there's the ribbon that can follow you around and allows us to query very quickly tens of thousands of endpoints. For example, SolarWinds. The big thing was that DLL, and we needed to find out what endpoints had it. Now, I don't know how long it took you to do that, but I provided a video, and Cisco provided direction in regards to how you can use something like OS Query, which is part of Endpoint AMP, which is integrated with SecureX, where I can ask it specifically, do you know about this DLL? And ask those tens of thousands of assets within seconds and get an answer back to know exactly what my risk level is. Now, going to OS Query, which is an element within Endpoint AMP, we call it Orbital, the capability itself. And what it allows us to do is exactly what I just mentioned about that SolarWinds DLL. But it does a lot more. I can take a forensic snapshot. I could look for specific things, whether I'm SecOps, IT Ops, or NetOps. It's also available in the ribbon, so I can pivot in the ribbon into Orbital and do my searching. And again, it provides deep, detailed information on the endpoint or from the endpoint within seconds. Cisco Secure Malware Analytics, so formerly ThreatGrid. So this is going to allow us to get detailed information about the malware, associated network traffic. We've got registry file entries. We've got DNS data. We've got the behavioral indicators that are triggered. Again, this allows us to look at that global base of intelligence around files that we've detonated in a sandboxed environment. Again, SecureX is going to be able to centralize all that insight, but it still allows us to pivot into the platform to do deep analysis if we wanted to, like endpoint detection and response, and looking at everything that took place from a device trajectory perspective. Or in ThreatGrid, where I can look at the sample and all of the things that were triggered during the analysis. Secure Network Analytics. This is where we get into an agentless-based behavioral and anomaly detection engine or platform. And what's cool about this is that it can do a lot of different things in regards to understanding the environment, what normal looks like, but also has the ability to use machine learning, behavioral analytics, or engines or indicators and obviously machine learning drives a lot of that as well. but also things as easy as a simple signature-based trigger, because it's a common-based attack that's very simple and trivial to detect. For example, SMB 445 probe. I don't need to do a network baseline in order to determine that an SMB 445 probe is taking place. But this also feeds into SecureX, so I can do additional mitigations. I can look at local sightings. There's threat intelligence that is provided, as well as having the ability to send the alarms automatically to SecureX. Secure Cloud Analytics, this is now extending the capability into AWS, Azure, GCP as an example, where we look at things like VPC flow logs and we do the analytics there. But we can dig deeper into the APIs and things that are happening within the cloud service provider themselves. Again, this provides dashlet capabilities within SecureX, and again, further accelerates our ability to do our investigations. And more are being added all the time too. Cisco Umbrella, so we know that this provides certainly deep intelligence when it comes to domain reputation, but now we get into local security insight. We can see and dig deeper into the domains themselves if we want to investigate. We can also block. So if we see a domain, we can actually block it, and then it'll automatically go into Umbrella and add that domain to a block list. And again, we can discover and block any source of attack very, very quickly. Again, whether you're on-prem or off-prem, you can certainly do that because Umbrella has the ability to mitigate risk both on and off-premise. Next-gen firewall, we talked about, centralizing any incidents that are created, but we also get insight into any sightings we see around IP addresses, URLs, domains, as well, are all going to be ingested and leveraged when we're doing our investigations. You also know that Cisco Secure Firewall, what we're talking about here is firepower, threat defense, or next generation firewall. When these alerts are sent, what I love about it is that I can go into that alert and very quickly parse what observations were triggered within that alert. So it could be an IP address of source destination. It could also be a domain or URL, but I can pick the elements that I think are important to my investigation. I don't have to take everything that was actually sent to me. I can be very selective. And when I go ahead and generate, what happens is that it'll generate the investigation, go out and reach out to every one of the products or modules that I have added into SecureX, and then provide me a more holistic view of what took place beyond that IPS trigger itself. Again, response, there's some response capabilities that you can build in as well. Now, I didn't cover the orchestration and automation workflows. Every one of these, there's some that are pre-built and created within SecureX. For example, I might want to, based on an alarm that took place on an endpoint, I may want to take a forensic snapshot and maybe automatically isolate the host. But before I isolate the host, I want approval from a manager, as an example. That workflow can be developed and created within SecureX. That specific workflow that I mentioned, outside of the request for manager approval before host isolation, is already built into SecureX. Cisco Defense Orchestrator, this is where we start tying a bunch of different technologies together, and it orchestrates the management of those platforms. And so there's some integration there as well if you're leveraging that capability. We've got our web security appliance, so Cisco Secure Web, and this is where we get into looking at specific web sightings that we may see. So Umbrella certainly is going to provide a lot of that intelligence, but proxy, if you have a traditional web security proxy, whether that be in AWS or on-premise, we're going to be able to enrich that data from a web content perspective. The Cisco Secure Workload, so now we're getting into what was formerly called tetration or application segmentation or zero trust in the data center. There's some dashboard capabilities that have been made available. There's some orchestration and automation that you can build in because there's APIs available that you can certainly leverage. But you'll see more and more integrations with this as well, where, you know, what I can see things like, if there's a process that executed something and it was malicious, can I pull that from anything that had a tetration agent installed on it? Why not, right? Duo, so this is where we get into secure access. MFA, this is also a part of zero trust, but now we can provide actions within orchestration, and you can build out automated workflows as well. And then additional security resources. So right out of the gate. So say, for example, your first question might be, you know, I don't own all these Cisco security technologies, and that's fine. There's third-party integration, so you can do the integration with third-party, but also it gives you a kind of view of where you can take the platform if you wanted to. So maybe today all you have is email and endpoint security from Cisco. You still get SecureX. Maybe you only have Umbrella for DNS layer protection. You still get SecureX. So these are all capabilities, these are all products that allow you to consume SecureX and that threat response capability at no charge. And you can feel free to integrate some of your existing investments as well. So now when we look at, remember we drew out this map, we understood the top line there is what we got on the EDR, where it's Outlook and or endpoint detection response. But Outlook, resume.m, WinWord, macro, PowerShell, ret.space, resume.exe. That's what happened on the endpoint. And when we drew this out. So you got to look at the first video if you want to see this built out. But the purpose here was, the ask was, what are some of the elements here, and what product provided SecureX that visibility? And so when you look at the red elements here, and I'm not calling out every piece, like I'm just showing folder path. So folder path regardless is going to be through endpoint amp as an example. But when we look at this piece here, these were all driven by Cisco Secure Endpoint or endpoint amp. And so that includes the target, right? We needed to be on the endpoint to see the endpoint actually execute that SHA-256. So that provides that capability. When we look at email components, that's actually going to come from our Cisco Secure Email. So formerly Cloud Email Security or Email Security Appliance. Some people might even know it as IronPort. The blue elements, that's what's going to enrich the rest of the story when it comes to the email component. So it's answering that. What did Outlook do here? Well, these are what ties into that message, right? We see association with a SHA of resume.m. We did call that out here, that we did see that on the endpoint. We also see the, who sent it, who received it, and the message IDs that are tied to it. Again, there's more blue here, right? I'm just not calling it all out. I'm just showing you the different elements that would have been pulled from the email security offering. And then, for example, you might have Umbrella providing some insights into some domain and URL activity. So we can see an IP address here. Again, this pulls that whole story together, right? At first we knew about Outlook all the way to resume.exe, but we didn't know anything beyond that. Now we know who got the email. We know there's another person with another email. We know there's an additional 2 targets. All of this now helps us defeat the adversary. The more information, the better, but you've got to streamline it and make it simple to view and understand. And Cisco SecureX, again, is free when you invest in one or more Cisco security technologies. It's really, really cool. It's really quick to integrate. So I will add that to the descriptions if you want the link to SecureX. But if you own a product, you should give it a try. And let's make it a little bit more difficult for the adversary to be successful in our environment. And when they do penetrate We're going to have the information that we need to make sure that we understand what took place, the scope of the breach, and put the mitigating controls in place so it doesn't happen again.